Welcome to More Creative. I'm your host, Ashley Wiley, and today we talk with Jessica Craig, an executive pastry chef in New York City, whose work has been featured in Essence Magazine, Michelin Guide, and the Pastry Arts Magazine. Throughout our conversation, we talk about Jessica's experiences in culinary school, how she decided to focus on pastry work, and her early career experiences in the culinary field. We also talk about her road to becoming an executive chef, from working in hospitality and aviation to major restaurant groups on Long Island and Manhattan, New York. Along with learning about how new recipes are created and the different challenges for working with different kinds of foods, we also hear about her experience participating on the cooking competition show Chopped. It was so much fun learning about Jessica and how she pushes the boundaries of creativity with food. I hope you'll enjoy this one. Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, I'd like to know, when you were a kid, what did you think you wanted to do when you grew up?
All right. So my aspirations when I was younger varied quite a bit. So it honestly depended on who I was looking up to at the moment. So I went through a phase where I wanted to be a cosmetologist because listening to the stories of my mom having a beauty shop, which she had right up until I was born, I think I didn't like it very much. I would cry all the time. So that I was part of the reason why she ended up closing it.
Oh, no.
But fast forward a little bit, and once one of my older siblings got through nursing school, like looking up to her, I was like, oh, I'm going to be a nurse. And then I went through a phase of drawing all the time. I'm part of the generation that was kind of, I don't know, I guess all the technology that we have now, I feel like we were the guinea pigs of it. So once I got into computers, then I was just like, ooh, I'll be a secretary. And my mom hated when I would say that in public. She's just like, stop telling people how you're going to be a secretary. Then once I started thinking more seriously about it, I'm like, I'm going to be a lawyer. That seems like a good career. And then I took a civil law class that totally changed my mind on that. Like the idea of sitting at a desk and having to learn all these things, it just didn't sit right with me. And I think it was once I was about to start applying to colleges that my sister was just like, hey, you love cooking. Why don't you look into culinary arts? And I looked at her and I'm like, what's culinary arts? So she had to explain to me that it meant cooking and it's something I could possibly do professionally. And once I looked into it, I'm like, actually, this seems pretty cool. I think I'm going to look into this whole cooking thing. And that's how that whole thing started.
Do you remember your earliest memory of cooking?
So growing up, like both my parents are from Jamaica, so most
Oh,
of the
cool.
food that I ate was Jamaican food, but I loved peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So I think that was quite honestly the beginning of it. It's like I'm not allowed to touch flames, but I can make the crap out of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then once I was old enough to actually cook, I remember turning to the same sister that suggested I start cooking. And I was just like, hey, can you show me how to do things in the kitchen? So I remember the very first thing she showed me how to make was eggs. And she's like, here, this is how you fry an egg. And I was like, oh, this isn't hard. This is pretty easy. And eventually, like, my mom invited me to start learning how she cooked and did things. And back then I used to make the cake mixes like the Pillsbury and Duncan Hines and things like that. And I would try to be fancy, maybe add an extra egg or some extra butter, some extra oil. I'm like, ooh, look at me chefing it up over here, adding extra things to the cake mix. So that's totally how that got started.
That's awesome. So, after high school, and you ended up going to the New York Institute of Technology, how did you decide on that school, and what was your education experience like?
So New York Institute of Technology happened because I wanted to go away to school and my mom was adamantly against it.
Mm.
I kind of applied to, I think, 3 schools, and I think New York Institute of Technology, Johnson& and Wales, maybe CIA. I think most of my classmates were applying to, like, upwards of 10, 12, 15 schools, and I'm like, "No, I wanna go Johnson& and Wales, but because you guys told me I need to have options, I guess I'll just apply to these other 2 schools." And when I approached my mom on it, she was just like, "No, you better get into New York Institute of Technology because I don't know where you're trying to go." And I'm like,
Oh,
"Okay,
no.
that's great." But in the end, it totally worked out. I ended up getting like a decent scholarship for the first year. And with all that being said, like the program there was really, really cool because the way it worked out was that you kind of started off with the same people in the beginning as in the end. So you start with a group of, I don't know, 10 to 15 people, and you learn a subject for 2 to 3 weeks. So it's pretty intense. So it's like you go through a week and then you have like a midterm or something along those lines, and then you finish out, and then you have a final and a practical, and then you move on to the next thing.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that's the way culinary school went. So like let's say if you had, I don't know, like there was a kitchen 101 class, and so you learn the basics in that class, but everyone can't take kitchen 101. So I believe my very first class was garde manger. So like you're kind of just thrown into it, which was both a blessing and a curse, because you just kind of hit the ground running. It's like, all right, well, you have no knife skills, but you have to dice this onion. So it's like, all right, great, sure, why not? So that program was 2 years, and then halfway into the program, you do an externship. And the externship that I did was actually at a Marriott on Long Island. And once I was done with the program there and got my associate's degree, I did an additional 2 years to get my bachelor's degree in hospitality management.
Oh, wow. So, when during your education do you sort of pick the path towards pastry, or is that something that you don't focus on until you get more into your career?
I think everyone's path is different. And for me, I wanted to learn a little bit about everything concerning cooking. I felt like that was very important. But I think when I figured out pastry is the path I wanted to go in was when I believe the restaurant is called Captain Bill's in Bayshore, on Long Island. And there, the position that I was working was cold station. So I was in charge of taking the lobsters out the tank and steaming them, which like to a new cook was just like, oh my God, I have to kill these poor creatures.
Oh, no.
And then take them apart, and I had to shuck oysters and clams and things like that. But the part of the job that got me was the fact that I got to plate desserts however I wanted. And it wasn't like a crazy spectacular dessert program that they had there, but it was my first taste outside of school of a plating service. And I remember thinking to myself, I have to learn more of this. But at the same time, realizing there's no way I could go to pastry school separately because school's expensive. So I kind of made the decision that I would work my way through the industry and learn that way. And thankfully, it totally worked out.
Awesome. So, what was your first experience like as a co-chef at City Cellar Restaurant?
Well, that was pretty cool. And just a funny story about that. So, the title of co chef, the other pastry cook and myself kind of came up with.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's a term I'd never heard of before, so I was really interested to hear what it actually was.
All right, so City Cellar is part of a restaurant group that originated in Florida, and so that particular location was their first New York location. I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure if it's still there or even if they ended up expanding beyond that in New York. But with all that being said, when myself and the other pastry cook was hired, we didn't have a pastry chef at that location, so the two of us were it. So any ideas that came from corporate or any idea that the chef had or anything that had to be executed was executed by us two cooks. And there are a lot of restaurants that operate that way. And if you think about it, when you have a chef, the chef has a sous chef, and then there's the line cooks, prep cooks, etc. So, not to talk smack, but the way a lot of restaurants get around that is they'll hire a cook and just give them the title of cook, when in reality, they're the pastry chef because
Oh.
they're not working under a pastry chef. So once the two of us walked away from that job and we were like putting together our resumes, we both agreed that we should call each other co-pastry chefs because that's essentially what we were doing.
That's a good idea, honestly. So, going into that position and not having too much experience in pastry before, what was that experience like? Was it a major learning curve for you, or was it something that you just really enjoyed and came fairly naturally?
I think it came fairly naturally because I was there as they were opening. So I was there part of the opening team even before the doors were fully open. Like we were prepping and getting ready for the soft opening and things like that. And I remember either the first or second soft opening night, because I remember at the beginning, the other pastry cook, she worked mornings until we agreed that I would be the one working mornings. So there was a few nights in the very beginning that I worked. So I worked dinner service and I don't remember what happened. I think I was trying to get plates into the window. All right, so I'm speaking kitchen talk. So the window is like where the chef or a server would grab the plate to bring to a table or, the
Oh.
expediter or whatever.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of delegating to people what to do and not realizing I was delegating to people what to do because I just saw things that need to get done and I'm just like, hey, you're standing there, do this. So it's just kind of came naturally. And I remember the corporate chef pulling me to the side and she's like, I like the way you took control of the station, last night. And I was like, oh, thank you. I actually wasn't thinking about it, but thank you. So it was definitely something that I feel like totally came naturally. I like working in a kitchen in a restaurant, it's one of those things where you either get it or you don't. And thankfully, I was one of those people that got it. So that was really cool.
You later went on to work at a restaurant called Nick and Tony's as a pastry sous chef. How did this position differ from your role as a co-chef?
Nick and Tony's was different in so many different ways. I feel like this was probably my first adult job, mainly because this was the first job that I had where I moved away from home.
Mm.
Nick and Tony's is one restaurant, well, the main restaurant of a restaurant group. So I think at that time they had either 5 or 6 restaurants. So out of Nick and Tony's, which is based in East Hampton on Long Island, we were making desserts for all the different locations and all the different concepts. To this day, it was the most different job that I've ever had in the industry because we were keeping things seasonal. We were changing menus across the board constantly or coming up with new specials. Or there was catering because at that time they had a location on the Upper West Side, which was Nick and Tony's Cafe, which was like a mini version of Nick and Tony's in the Hamptons. So like we were doing menu changes and things over there, working with the chef over there as well. So it was a pretty big job and it taught me so much.
Kind of going off of that and knowing that it was more of a restaurant group, when working in pastry, do all the restaurants under that umbrella tend to have the same pastry and dessert menu, or is it something that you have to curate individually for every restaurant?
It's something you definitely have to curate differently for each restaurant because each restaurant has a different price point or a different theme. Like, for example, Nick and Tony's is more of like an Italian Mediterranean theme. Then they have Talon Barbecue, which is like their barbecue spot. Then they have Rowdy Hall, which is more of like a French bistro vibe, La Fondita, which is Mexican. They were all totally, completely different. And we were creating food costing, testing, and creating things that were completely different for each thing.
When working with different restaurants of that sort, are there certain recipes that the restaurant already has that they would like to use, maybe something well known in the restaurant beforehand? Or is that something where you actually have a lot of creative freedom to make the desserts that you'd like to?
It's kind of a mix of both. I've come to realize for just about almost anywhere I've ever worked, there's always going to be the staples. And it also depends on how old the restaurant is too, because if a restaurant has been around for a while, then most likely they're going to have a staple, if not a few staples that people never want to see change. But at the same time, there's going to be parts of the menu that you can play with. So there's going to be like the recipes where it's just like, all right, these are our staples. People come here for these specific things, and you cannot change this. And then there's some wiggle room, which it can be a bit frustrating because it's just like you get hired for your talent and then you're kind of operating under the shadow of someone else that you may not relate to at all.
Mm,
It's a bit of a slippery slope sometimes.
that makes a lot of sense. So, how many desserts or pastries do you typically have to come up with for each restaurant?
Well, I mean, when I was there, it just depended on each restaurant's concept. Like Nick and Tony's itself has the tartufo, which never changes. I'm pretty sure they still have it on the menu now. And then around that, I actually had a lot of freedom with that menu. And I was able to come up with a range of seasonal items, which in addition to that, I believe it was like 6 things I was able to come up with. But with the other restaurant concepts, it was a little less, only because for the most part, it was mostly grab and go, fast casual kind of thing. Outside of Rowdy, I believe Rowdy was plated. So yeah, it totally depended on like the different concept of each restaurant.
Cool. So, You later became the executive chef while you were at Nick and Tony's. How did that opportunity come about, and how did that change what you did?
To be honest, I kind of ran from the position at first. I totally ran away from it. So I worked under the first pastry chef, who was Molly. And I remember the chef sitting me down and like kind of gauging me how I felt about taking on the position. And I was like, no, 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 no. I'm not ready for that. Like, hire somebody. So he did, and he hired another pastry chef, Mark, who I'm still friends with. And Mark did it for about a year. And when Mark was ready to move on, Chef sat me down again and spoke to me. It was like, would you like to take this position? And I was like, no, thank you. I remember he was trying to interview, through people, and no one was lining up and working out. And so we went into the summer technically without a pastry chef, but I was running things. Got through the summer, and at the end of the summer, he sat me down and he looked at me. He's like, now, Jessica, I don't want you to feel like you're the default pastry chef because we can't find anyone. But with that being said, you just did it for a whole summer. And, being the Hamptons and Long Island, it's the summer is truly the thick of it versus the rest of the year. So at that point, I looked at him and I was like, I actually enjoyed it. I'll take it. So essentially, I had to get thrown into the fire to realize I enjoyed the fire. After that summer happened, then I took on the position, even though technically I was kind of doing it anyway. I learned so much from the previous pastry chefs. I feel like I did a really good job, and it kind of got to a point where I felt like I could do the job in my sleep because I started off as pastry sous and then, slowly learning the job that way. And then once I became pastry chef, the whole thing kind of felt like a breeze. And a huge dream of mine was to work in New York City. So after having the position up until 2013, the winter of 2012 going to 2013, they did a big renovation at Nick and Tony's. And I had a huge hand with setting up the pastry kitchen for that. And I remember turning to the chef and being like, I think this upcoming summer is going to be my last summer.
Mm.
Like, I knew he heard me because he's a great guy. He's a great listener, but I feel like they didn't believe me. I was with him for a really long time. Like, at that point, I think we were approaching 5 years. So
Oh,
like
wow.
once I finally left, it was like about 5.5 years that I was with them. So yeah, it was bittersweet. I still love those guys. I still stay in contact on a certain level. Like, I'll reach out here and there. But yeah, it was just one of those things where it was time, and I just felt like I wanted to grow and expand, and I felt like I wasn't going to have growth unless I was in a different environment.
Coming from that and having your goal to be an executive chef in New York City, what was your next step from there? Were you ready to jump right in?
No, I wasn't. I totally wasn't. I was so scared, and it's very interesting because I feel like a lot of things I've done in my life, or even as far as my career, it comes from a place of fear. So as much as I felt like this was a move I should make, I was totally fearful, like a duck treading water the whole entire time. So I decided to take a step down, and I took a pastry sous chef position working with Alta Maria Group. It was tough only because I wasn't used to their kitchen culture. It was just very different. And given that I come from Long Island where I truly thought the kitchens were hard, it made my experience feel like child's play because it was a lot faster, it was a lot more intense, it was a lot more aggressive. It was just a lot more of everything. But with all that being said, it definitely gave me the experience that I needed to propel forward because after there, I did bounce around a little bit, including working for an airline catering company at one point. And the reason why I took that job is because it was so different from anything else I've ever done. I just wanted to get my feet wet and see what that was like. But shortly after that, I moved on to work at La Conda Verde. And I actually stashed at La Conda Verde while I was working with Nick and Tony's, which was pretty funny. So when the pastry chef hired me, she was just like, "You look familiar." And I was like, "Yeah, I was here when you were testing recipes to be the pastry chef at the Dutch." And she was like, "Oh my God." And I was like, "Yeah." I was the girl who came from Long Island to stage here. And she was just like, "Oh, okay."
Cool.
So I was able to work with them for about a year and a half until I became the pastry chef with Wartuzi restaurant. I was the executive pastry chef there.
After all those experiences, your experience at Wartuzi was one that you really, really enjoyed and allowed for a lot of growth in your career for you. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yes, for sure. So, like working with Wartuzi, in the very beginning, it was a little rough because when I first got hired, the pastry chef and pastry sous chef that was there before me wasn't there. So it was a, a very interesting transition because it was essentially like I showed up to work and I was just like, hey, I'm your pastry chef and I don't know what I'm doing. And not in the sense of I don't know pastry, it was just like I just don't know how things go here. So, like, this is going to be a huge learning curve for me. But with all that being said, once I got my footing and, I learned how things operate with the restaurant group, and I was able to hire a pastry chef that I was able to vibe with, and then we were able to build such an amazing team. I slowly started getting a certain level of recognition that I wasn't expecting.
Oh,
First, I believe it was Essence magazine reached out to do like a blog post about me, like just my story as being a chef. And I was just like, oh, wow, that's pretty amazing. That's awesome. And then not too long after that, Michelin Guide reached out to do something similar, and I was just like, "Oh, hello, thank you. This is awesome." At one point, one of the coordinators over at Museum of Food and Drink invited me to take part of the Spring Gala in 2019 as they were preparing for the African American exhibit. The coordinator asked for me by name and he reached out to one of the partners of the restaurant who forwarded me the email. And I looked at the email and like I was floored and I was thrown for a loop because I wasn't expecting anything like that.
mm-hmm.
It was a really cool experience because time and time again, I would have different publications or amazing people in the industry reach out to me and want to just talk about me, talk about what it is I was doing. And I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would have things like that happen in my career. And I'm super humbled by it and super thankful for all of it.
I mean, what an amazing experience to have your work recognized on such a level. I mean, I'm sure it was is very nerve wracking to kind of have more eyes on you, but to have the, I guess, the recognition and the knowledge that other people really admire your work and yourself, I think that's probably felt really amazing.
Oh, for sure. It felt awesome, and I have to, like, definitely give huge thanks to my team that I had during that whole entire time, like, they supported me and were there for me 110%, and I couldn't be more grateful, like, it truly was, it was such an amazing time.
Awesome. So, do you have a favorite flavor combination that you like to work with when coming up with new recipes?
To be honest, and I think this is probably true of just about anyone, and I'm not gonna, like, pin this on chefs, like, I feel like what people relate to most is what they enjoyed as a child. And
Oh,
for me, like, I usually lean on peanut butter and banana or, like, some kind of peanut butter fruit combination just from developing a more adult flavor palette. I do enjoy, like, strawberry and balsamic together a lot, maybe with some, like, creme fraiche combination.
yeah.
Honestly, it just depends on what's in season. Like, I totally blame my time in the Hamptons, but I truly do eat pretty seasonally. Like, right now, I have a shopping bag full of, like, different types of citrus right now because like, it's winter and citrus is beautiful, so that's totally how I operate.
Awesome. When you are coming up with new recipes, what is your process? I mean, where do you even start?
It honestly depends. So it depends where the idea comes from, because sometimes I'm just thinking of colors, or let's say Concord grapes came into season and it's just like, oh, you know what goes great with Concord grapes? Like maybe we can put it with some pear, maybe add some hazelnut to it, or like it just depends. And I usually brainstorm in a way where maybe I come up with too much, because then I can kind of pull away a little bit and then just kind of scale it back. But a lot of times I'm thinking of flavors, colors, and textures. That's honestly how my mind operates when it comes to coming up with a new plating. So I'm thinking, oh, these flavors goes together. And then I'm just like, ooh, but then this crunch on top of that soft, and then the ice cream, and then my mind just starts going crazy.
Where does that experience with things that work, where does that come from? Is that just really from trial and error, or is that something you can learn in school?
I really don't think that's something that school can teach you. Like I feel like school is the basic knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and school may teach you some flavor combinations that work very well, but I feel like some of it is definitely instinctual, and also, working with a chef and or mentor that you admire and maybe learning how they operate and maybe adapting that mindset to how you possibly would like to cook, or maybe you really admire the way this particular person cooks and you truly do want to emulate that. But a lot of it is instinctual as well as trial and error. Clearly, not everything I've made has been a classic. So there's definitely been some flops in there.
Sure. But it is really cool to hear. I mean, you hear about so many career paths where you can't really do that very well without going to school, but knowing that being a chef is something that you can really rely on your natural instincts and your natural talents and skills to propel you through your career. I think that's really awesome, and it just shows how much of a natural you are, and so many chefs are when they do create something awesome.
Well, for sure. Like in my career, especially given that I did culinary school and I learned pastry, like working on the job, a lot of the information that I learned was learned through observation or from what other pastry chefs have taught me. I feel like a lot of times maybe what I do isn't technically right by like pastry school standards, but like I promise you I will get the same results as like most any pastry chef. I feel like in my career, I've had other chefs and or cooks look at me sideways because I might do something a little differently, but at the same time, I'm still getting the same results.
Well, that's really, really cool. So, something that I've sort of noticed is Italian influences seem to be very present throughout your career. What draws you to Italian cuisine?
A huge part of it is growing up on Long Island because Long Island has a lot of Italian restaurants.
Oh,
But setting that aside, I think it's also because like Italian cuisine can be a lot more rustic than French cuisine. Especially like when I was going to school, I feel like those were your choices. It's like either you go down the French path or the Italian path.
oh, interesting.
And to me, Italian cuisine was a lot more forgiving, and it was okay to be not so perfect all the time because I feel like it's like French can be uptight and just very strict about like a lot of things. And whereas with Italian cuisine, I just felt like there was a lot more freedom to play with ingredients and things like that. So yeah, I totally think that's a huge reason why I went down that path.
Interesting. So, what is the most memorable or difficult ingredient you've ever worked with?
That's a very interesting question. I think the most difficult was probably huckleberries because they're a pain to get all the stems off if they're like the really tiny ones.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they're like a nightmare to get all the stems out to be able to work with it. But the most different ingredient would probably have to be like, all right, so when I left Long Island and I started working with Altamira Group, they used to use these stabilizers in their gelatos, and I remember asking questions about these stabilizers and never getting like an answer as to what exactly it was. And it was pretty weird to me because I'm just like, so like, what's in this? And it's just like, I don't know, makes it smoother. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. That's really weird. How are we using ingredients and we don't know what it is?
Yeah.
So I think that was probably the weirdest experience with using ingredients because like no one could explain it. And I remember like Googling these ingredients and I'm just like the internet couldn't tell me what it was. And I'm like, this is weird. This is not cool.
Did it help though? Was it actually something that made the final product good?
Yeah, like it totally did. Like it helped to make the gelatos creamier and the sorbet smoother, but at the same time, I wouldn't be able to tell you what about it made it do that because I to this day I don't truly understand what it was.
Oh my god, that's hilarious. So, do you have a favorite dish you've ever created?
Ooh, a favorite dish. I do. So one summer, I actually have a couple, but I'll focus on this one.
Sure.
So one summer, I did a strawberry crostata with fiore latte gelato, toasted pistachios, and a balsamic reduction.
Oh my
And
gosh.
for the life of us, we could not get this dessert to sell. And I was really upset because I knew it was really good.
Oh.
When I tasted the staff on it, everyone thought it was amazing. I'm like, all right, we're gonna sell gangbusters out of this dessert. And no, it did not happen. I was so disappointed, but to this day, I think that's probably one of the better ones that I've ever came up with.
Wow. I mean, it sounds delicious. So, one of the many opportunities you've had as a pastry chef is to appear on the cooking show Chopped. What was that experience like?
That experience was pretty intense. And it was pretty funny because I truly didn't think I was going to get on the show. And because of that, I didn't really do much to prepare. Like my sous chef was out of town. I guess whoever was supposed to be in the episode canceled, and therefore I was the standby. So they asked me to be in the episode. And the even crazier part is, as the episode was beginning to record, someone could no longer be a part of the episode. So then they had to call another person last minute to come to the studio to take that person's place. So it was a very interesting episode that got recorded. I guess I felt the weight of the fact that this is a show that literally everyone watches. Like, I wasn't really watching the show, but I also cook for a living, so like I feel like it's different. But like this is something that's watched nationally, if not internationally. And as I'm standing on set and I look to my right and I'm like, oh, there's Ted, like this is wild. This is, oh, judges, hello, good morning. So like this is happening. The day was pretty long because I made it to like the final round, although I didn't win. And it just made me learn a lot about how things go in food TV. Like I learned a lot.
It's interesting to hear. I mean, you kind of explained it a little bit, just the difference between going from the restaurant industry in Long Island versus the restaurant industry in New York City, but also kind of knowing that working with food is so different from also a restaurant to a TV setting as well. That's interesting to hear.
I mean, it's insane, and I can definitely say that each round was exactly 30 minutes. They do not give you extra time. If something doesn't make it on the plate, that is it. There's nothing you can do about it. It was just a lot.
It's fun to watch, but being on the show, I'm sure it was just so stressful. But really cool to kind of say that you got to do it at the same time.
For sure, because it's one of those things where like you watch TV and it's just like, oh, I could do that. If I was in this, I'll do this, that, and the next thing. No, you would not, because when you're there and those lights are on you, and it's just like, what? How do I cook? What? How? In 3 minutes, I got to figure out how. What? You just gave me shrimp covered in chocolate. Like, what am I doing with this?
Oh
Like,
my god.
yeah. So it was a lot.
That's understandable for sure. So, looking forward, what excites you most about the future of the restaurant industry and pastry?
That's a very interesting question because I feel like at this very moment, like given the state of affairs that's happening right now with like COVID and the restaurant industry, it's kind of tough to see the positive aspects. But with that being said, I think the good thing is going forward, we'll have a clean slate as far as kind of rebuilding the industry all over again. And with that being said, I'm also noticing a lot of pastry chefs taking on creating their own path and not depending on a restaurant or a bakery unless it's their own. I'm very excited about this moment where a lot of pastry chefs are taking charge of their career and their path and paving the way for making their own brand or creating their own line of whatever it is, or like in that aspect I feel like it's a very exciting moment because all the Instagram bakeries I've noticed online. I've noticed a handful of pastry chefs open up actual bakeries. So I think it's a pretty exciting moment right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of that also creating so much innovation with different types of pastry, and as the customer, that's really exciting to me, but as someone who's also in the industry, I'm sure that's exciting as well. So that is very hopeful.
For sure, because I'm seeing like so much variety, whether it be like Chef Paula, who's doing, all these indigenous pastries right now, or pastry chef Lonnie, who does a lot of gluten-free, vegan kind of things. So it's just like all like there's this whole line of different things that I'm noticing getting made, and it's really cool. And hopefully that gives hope to the future of pastry going forward, that there's still space for us.
Absolutely. So I do have a couple questions that I like to ask everybody that comes on the podcast. So the first one is, if you could choose any career to try other than your current one, and you didn't have to worry about money or extra education or anything, what would you like to try?
I think I would try a career in music.
Really?
I think I would try to be a singer-songwriter. When I was a lot younger, I used to play piano in my younger years, and I think a small part of me kind of wishes I didn't give that up.
Awesome. That's a great one. So, my last question is, do you have any advice on turning your passion into a career?
I think it's important recognizing your strong points, and also persevering is very important as well. I feel like most people can recognize when they're good at something. And as an example, Dory Greenspan, who's an amazing cookbook writer, in the beginning of her career, she applied to work in a restaurant kitchen and learned that she's not the best chef. But at the same time, she learns that she's a great cookbook author down the road. You know what I mean? Like her passion was food, and food didn't work for her in this one avenue, but it did work for her in another avenue. So I think it's a good thing to stick to your strengths and to try different things to figure that out.
That's excellent advice for sure. Well, Jessica, this conversation absolutely flew by. This was so much fun. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Jessica, her links are in the description down below. If you like the show, please leave a rating, subscribe, and comment on whatever platform you listen on. It really helps out the show. For more information or to submit your own questions for future guests, you can find us on Instagram at The More Creative or on YouTube at The More Creative Podcast. Again, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.